Hello and welcome to everyone, and thanks for being here or staying here for the next part of our conference discussions. My name is David Scobey. I'm the Dean of the New School for Public Engagement, a division here at the New School whose programs are organized around interdisciplinary engagement that combines liberal, professional, and practice-based education, both graduate and undergraduate programs, where we like to think of ourselves as our own little laboratory in what new forms of a university might look like. It's my pleasure to moderate this afternoon's discussion on the restructuring of universities. Our two presentations focus on what might be called the changing infrastructure, I mean both technological and fiscal infrastructure of higher education and the forces of change in each area. And we're lucky to have two distinguished leaders to teach us and also to catalyze our conversation. I'm going to introduce them quickly now and leave the podium to them. After each of their presentations, there will be much time for questions and discussion. First of all, then, Vijay Kumar is Senior Associate Dean of Undergraduate Education at MIT and Director of MIT's Office of Educational Innovation and Technology, where he provides leadership for sustainable, technology-enabled educational innovation at that university. He has served as Assistant Provost and Director of Academic Computing, providing leadership for units engaged in delivering infrastructure and services that integrate information technology, media services, and education. He was also the principal investigator of the Open Knowledge Initiative, an MIT-led collaborative project to develop an open architecture for enterprise educational applications. He's a member of MIT's celebrated OpenCourseWare Advisory Committee and a member of the Steering Committee for iCampus, an alliance for educational technology. His own training, interestingly, spans not only chemical engineering and industrial management, but also doctoral work and scholarly research in education. His own doctorate is from an education school. And his experience includes programs for teacher education and technology integration in K-12 education, a theme that's come up glancingly in our conversation so far and maybe will be more central here. And secondly, our second speaker is Henry Bienen, the President Emeritus of Northwestern University. Excuse me. President Bienen was the 15th president of Northwestern. He served from 1994 to 2009, a nationally recognized leader in higher education. He led Northwestern to prominence along many, many different areas. He was one of the first three university presidents awarded the Carnegie Corporation's Academic Leadership Award for innovative leadership in higher ed. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and of the Board of Directors of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's a political scientist with interests in political and economic development, comparative politics, and U.S. foreign policy. And before coming to lead Northwestern, was a longtime member of the Princeton faculty, where he also served as Dean of the Woodrow Wilson School. Vijay.
Thank you, David. Good morning, all. It's a real privilege to be here. That was a very long introduction. I forgot to mention I sing also, but I won't do that with you. I'm going to be rationally optimistic. Let's see. Maybe I can. Oh, that's wonderful. Okay, never mind the pretentious titles, but the landscape is really to suggest that there's, we're talking about a wide spectrum of interacting influences. But like I said, I'm going to be rationally optimistic, and hopefully my comments will reflect some of the hopes, aspirations, challenges that were identified today, earlier on in the panel, the wonderful panel that preceded this one, and some of the opportunities and the challenges that were identified in last night's panel. You all, Peter Brook, I was struck by the, eloquent remark that he made about the tsunami of crisis rhetoric. And alongside, I know there has been this cacophony that I hear about product, services, technology opportunities, learning management systems, and also along with that, a whole bunch of popular and scholarly literature. We are beset with pleas and predictions of the possibilities that technology proposes to really address some of the enduring challenges, a lot of which that we talked about and that we even heard from the audience yesterday, enduring challenges like access, cost, real access, which I'll talk about. So I thought I'd throw a couple of more things into that. Of course, disrupting class. This is on the long tail of Clayton Christensen's various productions on talking about disruptive innovation, and a collection of an anthology that, and this is a little bit of shameless self-promotion that I hope you'll forgive me for, but an anthology of articles around open education that was published by the MIT Press, and which reflects on which has about 29 folks who are leaders in various open educational initiatives, reflecting on the collective opportunity that this gathering storm of open education presented. And I hope to touch on some of that. By the way, this is actually walking the talk. This is available actually from the MIT Press for free as a download, and you can take a look at it. And I would recommend that you do. But the case that that was made, that I'll just very quickly emphasize, the case for all this came up quite strongly yesterday. You can look at it as from the demand side and from the supply side. The demand case has been made very, very strongly. All these items that you see listed before you were touched upon. The one thing that's not listed there that has been talked about this morning too is about the new generation of learners that are coming into not just K through 12, but into higher education. And more significantly, it's not just the millennials and Generation Y, but an important dimension of these new set of learners that we see in our institutions, which is the differentiated preparation that they have. And so there's a wide range in the extent and the ways in which they have been prepared to undertake this expedition in higher education. On the supply side, I believe there are two dominant forces, and both of which were referred to certainly by Jim Dudestad earlier. And you have technology as a force and the open movement as a force. And what I hope to do is illuminate and substantiate why these supply-side forces are indeed potent and hold some promise for real transformation in education. So when we think about technology, I have a whole list that I have there, and that's actually a list that was generated from, there is a report called the Horizon Report that this consortium called the New Media Consortium puts out. And this is, through a group process, collaborative process, which tries to identify technologies of significance to education and, does some amount of prediction on which will have traction over what period of time. So it's sort of a futuring exercise. And these are some of the technologies that were identified in last year's report as having potential impact over the next 2 to 4 years. And these are technologies typically that many of you have heard about. Mobile computing we all talk about, not just in this country, but it's very dominant presence, especially in Asian countries and in Europe. Cloud computing, the fact that we do not have to have computational resources situated where we are, but that we can, not unlike the supercomputing centers of the past or even earlier data centers before that we can actually have a lot of computational capacity that we can borrow and share from systems and services that exist elsewhere. A lot of things around analytics, how we can use data to actually understand what's going on with education, being able to visualize the data, visualize it also for deeper learning. Augmented reality, which is really trying to see how can we intelligently blend technology, electronic technology on physical artifacts to augment our understanding. How we can use, for instance, videos that depict lots of biological processes or botanical processes and impose them on things like on the ecosystem, on trees, so that we get to have a much more first-hand understanding of what's going on behind the scenes. So augmented reality, the semantic web, which is really trying to see how can we look at this interconnected web of World Wide Web and try to make sense, discover things in an English-like, in a natural language-like fashion. And of course, game-based learning. The point that I want to make to you is when you think about technology, think about it generously, at least for the next 15 minutes or so when I talk about technology. And likewise, when you think about open, open is not just about content, the course content that's been put up through initiatives like OpenCourseWare, but the fact that open is a handle, is a shortcut that includes a variety of things: open tools, open applications, policy enablers, legal enablers. So think about both technology and open generously, and so that we can understand and actually, bravely speculate on the possibilities. So my thesis over here is the intersection of a very generous definition of technology with this very generous definition of open. The confluence does have a really remarkable potential for educational innovation and transformation. So a little bit of open, and I'll substantiate some. Jim mentioned OpenCourseWare. Again, OpenCourseWare 10 years ago, MIT, at that time made this, sometimes some of us think very rash announcement, to make the content of all its courses available on the web for free for the world for educational purposes. And that was interesting. And, we look at a lot at OpenCourseWare, and we look at the courses. Sometimes we miss the point of how big and how substantial it is. We are talking about 2,080 courses, all the lectures, the assignments, a lot of them in video right now. So there is a lot there. And that itself is very interesting, and then people have taken various cuts, various ways of combining these courses, or the materials there. They're being used sometimes directly, sometimes as models, sometimes as supplements, and I go around the world talking about it and find out newer and newer ways in which people are taking advantage of that particular resource, which in itself is interesting but not interesting enough. Why this is the beginning of a movement, and why we use terms like a movement, is what quickly followed OpenCourseWare was the OpenCourseWare Consortium, where today there are upwards of 250 institutions around the world who are making the content of their courses available. So this is significant. Suddenly you see, and these institutions are all over this country, all over the world. And then you start looking at 13,000 courses on growing. And in fact, one of the institutions, my alma mater in India, the Indian Institute of Technology, they had a sizable initiative called NPTEL, which is for engineering courses that's available on YouTube. They have joined the consortium. So you can see this growing corpus of educational materials that's available, which reflects one aspect of this explosion. And of course, there's this other alongside dimensions of the explosion, which is a whole bunch of resources, which might not necessarily be courses, open resources, open publications, lecturelets. We've all heard about Khan Academy. So we hear about Stanford's online courses. There's a whole bunch of other initiatives that speak to these other dimensions of open, which are not just course content, but tools and applications and published resources. So this is big. Closer to home, and one of the things that we do is create a lot of visualization materials in order to, this is from my office at MIT, where we have all these products that are created, and the intent over here is to make the practice, the tools, the excitement of research available very easily to freshmen, to undergraduate students. And I mean, part of this exercise is to use technology to take away the fog that usually accompanies technology. The idea is that biologists and biology students can do their thing without having to learn Unix. And so we create these, and they are very, very intimately tied to deeper learning, to the problems that our faculty say are important in order to bring strong learning experiences to the students. And then we make them widely available in open source for free to the world to use. I have some URLs there that you can take advantage of. There are things like this, Mastering Physics, Semi-Intelligent Tutors. So there's a variety of resources. They're not just static content. They are designed for different purposes, for different pedagogical goals. They are interactive exercises. Many of them take advantage of contemporary learning theories. So the corpus, the vector of resources is rich, is varied, and is not just static. And so you can see the implications of that when you start thinking about the possibilities. A favorite example, whenever we talk about open stuff, I always draw up this example. The gentleman on your left is Jesus de Alamos, whose brainchild this was. Typically, when we talk about open courses, open resources, we think about a whole bunch of learners accessing content. And we are often reminded that the educational experience, especially, and I speak with some bias about science and technology, that there's a lot of hands-on experience, laboratory, parameterized labs, lots of, MIT's motto is around mens et manus, which is really the blending of the mind and hand. So how do we, and there is this assumption normally that we cannot have end-to-end quality experiences in the open networked world. Well, iLab sort of challenges that proposition. This initiative allows learners anywhere to access real labs over the internet. They launch a browser, so you could have experiments like we have at MIT, network analyzer equipment, chemical reactors, flagpole experiments for seismographic measurements, you name it, which students in Singapore, Sweden are accessing. Now, the interesting thing about iLabs is not that MIT has 5 or 6 experiments that students around the world access, but the architecture, the open architecture, allows anyone, anywhere to create labs and make it available to the students around the world. So you can start thinking about this kind of end-to-end experience. We were sitting at a meeting in China, in Dalian, where this professor of computer science, she suddenly starts showing the labs that she has created for her students around China. So now, there are a couple of implications about this that you have to think about. So the fact that some labs are expensive, and now you can suddenly have this notion of shared labs. So you start thinking about how this is beginning to alter the economics of education. So lab experiences, laboratories, which are typically expensive, difficult to configure, can be much more widely available. And when you think about this in conjunction with things like OpenCourseWare, you start seeing the possibilities. But there's another dimension that I want to point out, especially with the educational hat on. Well, 2 dimensions. One is the fact that you start seeing communities of learners around the world accessing the same labs, talking to each other, exchanging results, bringing their context into the learning experience, which is quite powerful. So this is the kind of sort of change, pedagogical change that you see being possible through initiatives like this. And there is another dimension of the economics of this. Now, labs, typically, I went to an engineering institution. Labs are typically re-engineering exercises. You always knew the value of gravity and sort of work back. That's one thing. There was a lot of latency. We have a lecture. 2 weeks later, you have the lab and the topic, out of sight, out of mind. The connection is not there. One of the things with things like iLabs, and so there's a lot of cost to the learner, a lot of hidden cost to the learner in terms of labs as they're traditionally done. iLabs actually overcomes that. Initiatives like this overcome that because you have a configuration that's available. People can pop in and pop out. It's available 24/7. The kind of latency that we typically experience in traditional settings is not there. So that's an example I point to. One more quick technology example. One of the things that we see a lot is a lot of video lectures. You look at Academic Earth, you look at OpenCourseWare, Yale's offerings. There are lots of good quality video lectures available openly now. Now, by the way, Walter Lewin, the person that you see over there, he teaches an introductory physics course. Those of you who have not gone to the OpenCourseWare site and looked at this, I would really urge you to do this. This man, he just retired, but these lectures are fantastic. And I keep saying even if Walter doesn't get a teaching award, he should certainly get an Oscar. They are just dramatic. Now, the technology over here that I'm talking about is something called the Spoken Media Browser. And this is built on voice recognition technology and artificial intelligence, which allow you to transcribe automatically the contents, the audio portions of a video lecture, and then be able to search it with facility based on concepts. So imagine you have all of Walter Lewin's introductory physics lectures. Let me apologize. Most of my examples are science and technology examples. It's an affliction, it's a job-based affliction. So. But let's say, I missed my class when he was talking about angular momentum. I go back and I can search for all the lecture. I don't want to wade through 21 hours of lecture trying to find out when angular momentum was covered and angular momentum in context was covered. I go back and I'm able to search and find all those segments where angular momentum was covered with facility. Not only that, and here's when I'm going to sound like an ad, but as soon as that pops up, I can also use recommenders where they tell me, if you're interested in learning about angular momentum, here are some related materials. It goes, scans the internet, brings that. Or here are lectures by others you might find useful. I always like to tell the story of when my dad taught me probability and statistics. I didn't understand a word because all I saw was an angry guy yelling at me. But the volume. But later on, when I learned it from my wife, statistics, and she's a mathematician. The point is that we learn in different ways. So the system actually allows you. We can think about systems where we can go find alternative resources with the assumption that we learn in different ways, that we might have different possibilities. So that's how the ecosystem is changing. And not only that, to a point that was being made earlier on today. If I'm some other instructor who needs to teach concepts around angular momentum, I don't have to do it. If I have a very, very good example already there, I can point my students to Walter Lewin's example and say, look, here are these topics, and go to. So you start seeing that the production function of what you're going to do here is going to change, and start imagining the implications for cost of education, for quality of education. So why all these examples? What I'm trying to say is, these things, this confluence of technology and open really has some profound potential for changing the ecology, as in who's learning, how are learning resources produced, where learning is happening, and also the economics of education. And one aspect that all these point out, one notion is the notion of abundance, that suddenly you have access, educational opportunities and educational resources accessible in an unprecedented fashion. And I use this term actionable access because a lot of the open resources, when we talk about open, those of us who wear, and I know there are some in the audience who wear the religious open hat, we talk about open not just in terms of things being visible and legally available, but the fact that they are designed in a way that they can actually be reused, remixed, revised, and redistributed. So there's a lot of agency for the learner, for communities that it brings in, and that's the kind of productive, actionable access that I'm talking about. It provides alternate modules, and this notion of blending the physical, the virtual iLab demonstrates that potential, augmented realities demonstrate that potential. But a sophisticated way of thinking about boundarylessness, not just across geographical boundaries, not just across disciplinary boundaries, but the fact that the boundaries between the in and the out are much more porous, much more diffused. So there was a question earlier about students interacting with and being able to modify the curriculum and the learning process. That happens. And in fact, there are some very, very good examples about how students are on the fly helping recreate the syllabus and the curriculum through their interaction with these materials. So I'm talking about that kind of boundarylessness. And of course, through analytics, the fact that you can have, based on the data, watching the data, you can actually create customized interventions based on how people are learning, the difficulties that they're experiencing. And most importantly, the fact that by virtue of being open, you are actually bearing your processes. There's a dimension of, when MIT put out its courses, I actually looked at it as a very, very humbling exercise because there were two statements over there. One was a statement which said, look, we don't know about how to do online education. That was then 10 years ago. There were lots of institutions which were doing it. But we do know that our value proposition is derived from a very high bandwidth of interaction between great students and great faculty. So all we can do is take a picture of that and put it up there. That was OCW. That was then. The other statement, sort of humility, and I think courage was the fact that said, look, this is what we teach. This is all our stuff. Have at it. So you open yourself to critique and to the possibility that things can change. And if you can actually build open design so that you can actually change your curriculum, make it adaptive to different things, and subject it to the possibility of improvement, I think we would have moved a long ways. So those are the opportunities. I mentioned all kinds of, one of the things when we talk about abundance is the fact that this technology and openness is actually creating the possibility of moving from teaching to learning. So suddenly learning is available in all its modalities, flexible learning, anytime learning, just-in-time learning. So we can start thinking about sort of factoring or chunking productively and offering learning opportunities in several unconstrained ways. And you see these. And then there are issues around how do you certify different kinds. So suddenly the marketplace of educational opportunity opens up in very interesting ways. Now, I've used words like profound change and so on, and some closing comments over here about that. One of the things that we find this can do is really challenge old notions, old relationships between access, cost, and quality. John Daniels, who was the ex-chancellor of the Open University, he says it very eloquently when he talks about the fact that he talks about this triangle. He calls it the iron triangle of access, cost, and quality. That this is an immutable triangle. Essentially, the suggestion is, in our traditional situated learning models, you always think that if you increase access, quality will diminish, or if you increase quality, cost will increase. And this leads to lots of these assumptions about exclusivity, linking, sometimes or very insidious relationships between exclusivity and quality. And so technology and openness challenges that structural relationship. So it is actually, you could think about a possibility where you could have great access, great quality, but with little cost. And there are lots of factors, the agency of the community, the amortization of learning opportunities, all that could play into this kind of a structural change. The other change that I talk about a lot is, and here's where we can discuss. There are other structural changes when we talk about credentialing, etc. Other structural changes, the relationship between the institutional, the learner, and educational opportunities and knowledge, the fact that, and there was some reference made to it, that you could disaggregate some of the services. Maybe it need not be as self-referential as it is right now. Maybe this notion of certification credentialing could actually happen somewhere else. You could change what's happening in the class is different from what's happening outside. There's a lot of, New York Times last week had a lot of articles on the flipped classroom model where you say, when we come to class, we're going to have more recitation-like sections, because a lot of the stuff that happens in lectures can actually be online. So you can start thinking about different kinds of arrangements. So there are things like the peer-to-peer university where self-learners form communities around openly available courses. They give out badges as indicators of, as substitutes for credentialing. So there are lots of alternative models of producing and delivering educational opportunities that are coming up. So what does this mean? So in the large, I was sitting back and thinking, so what we are seeing is we are going towards an environmental landscape where we go from visible resources to usable resources, and you can see all those. A couple of these that I'll highlight is, because it's come up, I was in Israel, and someone asked me after a presentation, I said, oh, look, it seems like, based on what you're saying, we could actually compress the time that a student spends in college. We could have 2-year degree programs instead of 4-year degree programs. And I said, yes, but it's also possible, therefore, that we can think about extending a degree program over the lifetime of an individual, because they pop in and out, right? And those are the kinds of possibilities we can think about when we think about it's moving from a limited term educational model to a varying lifelong kind of a model. One of the things that I talk about a lot when I was working with India's National Knowledge Commission, where India is a country in a rush, and trying to say how can we rapidly provide access to quality educational experiences, and they were all thinking distance education. And one of the things that we find is distance education is quickly viewed as a second-class citizen. So now you have this possibility of network-enabled open education actually becoming a central modality for delivering quality education. So you heard a lot of references to Chuck West, under whose watch OpenCourseWare is launched. You heard indications of this vision going ahead, even in the previous panel. This statement from him, we are seeing the early emergence of a meta-university, a transcendent, accessible, empowering, dynamic, communally created framework of open materials and platforms on which much of higher education worldwide can be constructed or enhanced. Sort of a encapsulation of the vision that was glancingly referred to in previous panels. So we aren't there yet. Lots of challenges. Readiness becomes an issue. One important aspect of readiness that I always point out is, it's loosely called, our cultural inertia, but it has to do a lot with lots of our models of education delivery, business models being built on this notion of scarcity. So you look at it, our fee structures, our attendance structures. I call it the butts and seats models. So that's certainly a challenge. So moving from this notion of scarcity to abundance, and therefore trying to reconstruct what education could look like, is difficult. I have to say, when I hear the audiences, when I talk around, you can see that there's momentum plus in that direction. There is an important notion, and that I always remember when I wear my undergraduate, when I'm with my colleagues in the Dean of Undergraduate Education's office. It is very important to remember in all this, and this got played out in yesterday's panel particularly. It's important to think about what this whole education business is about. What do you want to keep? There are lots of things. We talk at MIT a lot about our core values, the proximity of research and teaching, the fact that we want to have a high bandwidth of interaction, transferable skills and competencies. So as we are thinking about this, the intent is not to throw out all that, but to remember, as we think about change, what we want to keep and how do we recontextualize this given the new affordances of things like open-end technology. This used to be, my doctoral program was in future studies. This actually used to be in a graduate student office. So there's a, thank you.
Do you have a presentation, anything electronic? Or... No. Thanks, Vijay.
Well, Ariane asked me to talk about the ever-rising costs of university education, and can limits be imposed? And to that, I added the issue of revenues. But before I get on to the question at hand of costs and revenues of universities as we look to the future, I find so many of the themes of last night and today interesting to me. And at the risk of adding to my own introduction, which David gave, I'm on the board of the education of the Chicago public school system. So I was very interested in the discussion about K through 12. Just a fact, something like 8% of the graduates of the Chicago public school system, and there are about 400,000 students in that system. It's the third largest in the country. About 8% are college ready. I wouldn't want to say how many of the teachers in that system are college ready, but nothing like 100%. I'm also, I chair the board of a for-profit higher ed, so I'm very interested in the discussion of access. There's goods and bads of those for-profits. I think mine is pretty good, or I wouldn't chair it. But I should say that we meet some of those 8%, 10 years out, and try to provide access to a working population who have families and who are very different from the 18 and 19-year-olds who enter into colleges and universities straight off the bat coming out of high school. And finally, I chair the board of Ithaca Harbors, which is a not-for-profit here in New York, which is the old J store spun out of the Mellon Foundation that was alluded to, plus Portico and some other places that are looking at technology and have been involved in technology. And one of the things that we're looking at, Vijay, and trying to do some structured studies is how people learn on online education, which is not so self-evident. Most of the studies have not really been very good because they've not been random studies of people doing online interactive education, but rather people who choose to do online. And to look at this, you really need some kind of random study. Anyway, having said that, I want to get on to my topic. So I'll say some obvious things, and I hope a few things which are not so obvious. But if you look at the revenue side of universities first, and they have a stream of revenues, income from their endowments, if they have endowments. And of course, people have talked a lot about the heterogeneity. Jonathan has, and Bob Zimmer did last night, of the places we call colleges and universities in this country. And they run from very, very high per capita endowments like Princeton, and for that matter, Northwestern, running into the billions and tens of billions in the case of Harvard and Princeton, of endowments, to places that have essentially no endowment at all. Tuitions, again, extremely variable, from low tuition places in some of the public, though rising. As you all know, the public institutions have been rising, their tuitions have been increasing at a rate much higher on average than the privates because of what was discussed, the cutback from states. Very, very low tuitions in the community colleges and two-year places. But again, huge variability, and I'll come back to the possibility of, in the future, of thinking about these tuitions. And then giving, donations, annual giving, capital giving, which can replace or ameliorate items on the expense side of the ledger. And again, that giving or donations come from different sources, from private individuals, from corporations, from foundations. There's also the government via direct payments, largely but not exclusively, to public universities, but also through project funding, research funding, and government indirect, which has to do with the costs that are applied as indirect cost recovery to research. It's universities who are research universities. I always had a joke. It was sort of like being in the garment industry when you did research. You know, you'd lose $1 on every blouse, but you'd make it up on volume. Universities lose money on research, and they do research not to make money, but because it's part of their mission if they are research universities. But the federal government has pushed down, through OMB, the cost recovery such that research is basically a loser unless you can make money from the commercialization of research, which, while touched on, was not very much dealt with. Northwestern was very lucky. We have a pharmaceutical product, which we called our drug money, which came out of the chemistry lab, which led to the largest drug ever to come out of a university, Lyrica, for neuropathic pain and epilepsy, which brought the university so far over $1.1 billion. If you look, and you can look because the figures are published, at universities that make money from commercialization, very few. Columbia has had a deep pipeline, MIT, but very few universities net even recover the costs of their technology transfer offices. And when they do make money, it tends to be from a one-off product, like Emory had a drug they sold to Gilead, we licensed our drug to Pfizer. But typically, commercialization of research is not a money-making product for universities. Athletics was touched on. A young lady raised the question to Jim Dudestat, and I joked to Jim that university presidents get religion on athletics after they leave. And I would say that was true of Jim, and I would say it was true of me, too, to some extent, in all honesty. If you take all the Division I programs, there are about 120-odd Division I programs. The Ivies are not Division I programs. They don't give athletic scholarships, and they're not big-time athletic programs, so they're not necessarily inexpensive athletic programs. But if you take the big programs, about 10 or 12 on average a year out of 121 make money from athletics. So if you think universities are in business to make money from athletics, I can tell you from a place, we went to 6 bowls when I was at Northwestern, we don't make money. Athletics was a big money loser when you take all the costs in for Northwestern. And that's been true of all but a few places. Ohio State, Michigan has lost money, made money. USC makes money, Texas makes money. And usually you make money through your TV deals, through conference deals with ESPN and ABC or CBS or whatever. Unrelated business income. I had students who always complained that we were doing business with sweatshops in producing T-shirts. They thought we made a lot of money from this. Maybe we were doing business at some of the wrong places in Costa Rica or whatever. I doubt if any year, but the year Northwestern went to the Rose Bowl, we ever had revenue over $200,000 from products. I only wish we sold a lot more sweatshirts and T-shirts. We didn't. Okay, so without getting into detail on each item I've mentioned, there's almost everywhere you look pressure on the revenue side of all the categories that I listed. Endowments are not back to where they were in 2008. Again, the performance of them are variable. Some of them have come a long way back, but costs have risen a lot since 2008. So if you look at the stream of income off your endowment, you're in worse shape today than you were in 2008, even if you had multi-billion-dollar endowments. Charitable giving is not as buoyant as it was. Again, it's a variable across. Stanford seems to have no trouble raising $800 million a year, year to year. But for most places, charitable giving follows the markets, at least roughly speaking. And when the markets are bad, individuals are less happy to give sizable sums of money. Foundation endowments are not back to where they were, and thus foundation giving is lower than it was. And corporations, above all, have pulled in their donations. Government funding in real dollars is well off its high, and likely, as we look to the future, to take much bigger hits from budget crises. If you look at the states, in the past, states that were reluctant to fund a lot of operational things still funded capital buildings at Illinois and Wisconsin. Why? Politicians liked it. It's jobs, construction, business that you do. And today, their capital budgets are so in peril at almost every big state, California, Illinois. I don't know how New York looks. I can't believe it's a lot better. That even capital budgets are under huge pressure at the state level. And I think funding will continue to decline along with support for tuitions and the operating budget. Federal support for tuition payments for the poorest of our would-be students come from Pell Grants, and the Obama administration significantly raised Pell Grant funding, and I think that funding will be, I know it's under pressure from Republicans in the House, and I don't know whether the President and Democrats in the Senate are going to be able to hold the line on Pell Grants. I suspect they're not, that they'll compromise out some of that Pell Grant money, so we may have seen the top of Pell Grant funding. And the Office of Management and Budget will continue to pressure indirect cost rates. So costs are bearable in some sense at the universities if revenues are robust, but they're not going to be robust. There's going to be pressure everywhere as we look to the next decade, I think at least, on the revenue side. So what about the costs themselves? What about expenditures? Now, expenditure limits can always be imposed. It's hard to do this in universities. We have the conceit that all the things we do at university are good things, and I think that's largely true. It's never 100% true. And again, we need to distinguish among categories of higher education institutions as we consider possibilities. Research universities have such different cost structures than liberal arts colleges that they're not the same animal. They shouldn't even be discussed in the same way. And within research universities, those who have medical schools and those who don't are very, very different beasts. And some major research universities like Princeton don't have medical schools. And you know the old joke that the president goes to hell instead of to heaven, and what does a president of a university find when they go to hell? 2 medical schools. Now, I didn't feel that. I thought the medical school did great things at my university, and I think by and large they do, clinical care. Again, there are lots of variability, whether they own hospitals, don't own hospitals. But at Northwestern, at least, 60% of the research that was generated by the medical school. So medical schools are very, very heavy actors where you have them inside a research university. If we ask what are the big ticket cost items at research universities, building programs, if you build research facilities per square foot, it's very different than building facilities for a history department or an English department. The cost structures are just very different in the sciences and engineering. And not only do buildings have capital costs and debt servicing, but they have operating costs. So some universities that started building a lot, like Cornell, which went into very heavy building projects over the last decade, cut back because the operating costs have been so high. Harvard, as many of you know, postponed a lot of its campus across the river. Big hole is there. So what you're seeing is retrenchment in a lot of places on the Capitol building side in order to deal with costs. Financial aid. Even here, I would say, where there's been a commitment to what was referred to in the past, last evening and today, as need-blind admission, the question is, what does it mean? So what need-blind admission meant is you would admit students irrespective of their need, and everybody who got admitted to Yale or Princeton and Northwestern was given enough fellowship money or scholarship money to come to the university. When the endowments were very high, a number of universities went on for essentially grants without loans. Harvard, Yale, Stanford did it to a very high extent. So if you had family income, if you were in a family of income of $150,000 or less, which very few American families, I don't know what the census data would tell me, what percent of American families have incomes of over $150,000 or $160,000, very few, probably a couple of percent. You would get a very heavily grant component. Some have already cut back on that. I doubt if the universities knew that their endowments were going to be under so much pressure that they would have gone for such buoyant grant programs rather than loans. Williams has already cut back on it. A couple of others have done. I would suspect we'll see more of that. It'll be a change of the mixture between loan and grants rather than the abandonment of need-blind admission. I think the elite universities that have significant endowments will be extraordinarily reluctant to give up need-blind admission. At least I hope so, and I think so. They will not give up need-blind admission easily, but they will cut back on this mix or alter the mix of grants and loans, which means more of a burden in the future as students take out loans, which is very unfortunate because it structures to some extent what students do after they leave the university, where they go for jobs that can help them pay off their loans rather than, say, for public service jobs where it's more difficult to do that. So I think there'll be some pullback on this. Research costs. I want to say something about this because I think here there's room for a lot more collaboration than we've seen between universities. Jonathan referred to this, and I want to take it up a little bit. The research costs have just skyrocketed. And if NSF and NIH funds are scaled back, as they think they're in the process of doing it, I think research costs are going to have to be scaled back at the university. I know some of the faculty don't like to hear it, They think the university can support the kind of research structures that have been funded out of largely federal funding. It's simply not possible. It doesn't compute. It's not going to happen. At a research university, the time horizons are very peculiar. Just think about it. You build a major medical research building. By the time you plan it, raise funds for it, and actually build it, could be 5 to 7 years. And meanwhile, you're trying to predict what NSF and NIH funding streams are. And that's at the whim of Congress every year. When I would go to Congress, I would say, look, at least give us 2-3 years predictability on the funding sources. Congress doesn't want to do that. It's never done that. And so you're at the mercy of having built these structures and then perhaps not have the money that will float a lot of your faculty's research. So the number of projects that get high scores at NIH today, but which get funded, are very different than 5 years ago. It's a real issue for universities. Should all universities aspire to be powerful research universities? And I think the answer is surely not. And in fact, some have not tried, and I doubt if we're going to see much concerted attempt to move into this game if you're not there already. On the collaboration side, we created something called the Chicago Biomedical Consortium, which was a collaboration of Northwestern, the University of Chicago, and the University of Illinois in Chicago to do biomedical research. And while you run up against what Jonathan referred to as the competitive structure of American universities, I do think we have to tilt this to a more collaborative structure. The American model has been an extremely competitive model. You try to hire the best faculty from each other, and you try to compete in many of the same areas of research. It leads to a lot of redundancy. It leads to high costs, but it's worked pretty well, at least when the economy is growing and there's a willingness to fund that research. It doesn't work so well under conditions of austerity. Bob Zimmer's predecessor by one, Hugo Sonnenschein, came to me. We were both Princeton colleagues and said, what about building something simple like an offshore library storage together? I said, great idea. Let's go to a low-rent district somewhere in the boondocks or in a cornfield somewhere and build it together and save money rather than try to build it on campus. I can say I could get that through my faculty. I didn't notice he could get it through his, and so we didn't. We went and built our own, and he built even much more expensive one. If we had to do it all over again, I would say we should have built it together. I said so at the time. So I think this competitive model has led to advantages for the private universities at a time of austerity of the public ones. We can now poach faculty from Berkeley and UCLA at Northwestern that we had historically a hard time doing. Good. I go to poach them. I'm sure my successor goes to poach them. Is it good for the country? It's not good for the country. To have a diminution in the quality of the great public flagship universities is a disaster for the country. So while I would continue, if I were still in the job, to try to poach, I do think it's a very bad situation that we've come to. Athletics, I want to finish up by saying a word on. I serve on the Knight Commission on athletics. I've already mentioned very few universities make money out of athletics. I think we need a vast ratcheting back. We need to lower the number of scholarships in teams. We need to lower the number of administrative people. If I told you how many Gophers there are on the football administrative staff, you'd be amazed. The video coordinator and the assistant video coordinator. And to me, it doesn't make sense. It is an arms race. It's very hard to get hold of when you're in competitive conferences. But I think we're beginning to see certain reforms. The Knight Commission pushed the NCAA, and President Emirate of the NCAA, who had been previously President Chancellor at LSU and is now was president of the University of Washington, is unfolding various reforms. I hope that we'll be able to make more progress on this. Student life enhancements, and that's the final point I'll make. The university can do without climbing walls, which is my metaphor for things that are inessential. But when we think, somebody from the floor last night tried to embarrass I think, the Chancellor of CUNY by saying, what's the ratio between administrative people and faculty? But a lot of the adding of administrative people at colleges and universities came from two sources. It came from federal regulations, which imposed regulation after regulation on you, unfunded mandates, which led to an expansion of your administrative staff, and it came from student demands. Student demands for things when I was in college at Cornell, a very long time ago, just weren't there or weren't effective in the same way. So we've proliferated student services, which I don't necessarily think is a bad thing, but it's a cost. So it didn't just grow like Topsy because administrators somehow were unconscious of what they were doing. It came from demands from different sources that administrators were often responsive to. And I think budget crises focus the mind. And we didn't do much zero-based budgeting at my university until we often got into really having to do it. Zero-based budgeting from time to time is a good thing because it allows you to go back to basics and say, do we really need this or that? And while I'm not completely optimistic, it's going to deal with all the problems. And I'm actually optimistic about some of the things Vijay spoke about, technologies. And here, and it's the very last thing I will say, I think you're going to see lots of experimentation in the future of places like Berkeley, Minnesota already saying, well, if we teach statistics, why don't we teach it online? Not to people off campus, but people on campus. And the question is, how interactive is it going to be? How good are the programs? MIT has been a pioneer here. Lots of places are going to look at this as a cost saving. But at the same time, I think a lot of the value in the universities has been the kind of seminar teaching I think Jonathan and others talked about, one-to-one interactions. And I hope while we can save money in some large classes with some online technology, that we don't give up what's been very precious, and that is student-to-student interaction and faculty-to-student interaction. Maybe we'll get some of it online. Maybe we'll do it in a blended way. I don't quite know what the combination is going to be, but I think we'll certainly see many, many technological innovations in the future pushed by cost concerns. Thank you.
Thanks to both Vijay and Henry. I feel like our panel has the structure of a classic I've got good news and bad news joke. The good news is all kinds of interesting blue sky opportunities for networking and new pedagogy that Vijay talked about under the sign of the Metaversity, and the bad news are the constraints on both the revenue and cost side, and the need to focus our minds in the face of austerity that Henry talked about. But it seems to me both the good news and the bad news point, and in fact work together towards the need to think in kind of dramatic and even radical ways about new practices. So I want to invite folks to come up and pose their own questions and responses, but let me take the prerogative of the moderator and ask one or two questions by way of starting that conversation, and meanwhile asking you to think about the questions or comments that you're interested in making. So let me pose two areas that seem to me will look very, very different in, say, 20 years, both under the pressure of new possibilities and new constraints. One is the temporality of education, and by that I mean both lifelong learning that Vijay talked about, but also the explosion of the academic, the dissemination, the decimation of the academic calendar, which to my mind would be a really good thing, because learning, I think, often happens in short and compact temporal segments, often needs longer, more sustained segments, and while the semester is a good way to allocate labor and credit, I don't think it's often a good way to create educational experiences. And the pressures that both our speakers talked about, it seemed to me, open up an opportunity to think about how learning happens over time differently. And the second area that I think will look very different in 20 years is the composition of what we might call the community of educators. And I don't use the word faculty, because it seems to me one of the implications of Vijay's comments and also people working in the field of community-based learning that I come out of is that there's a whole range of essential educators who don't look like faculty, even as categories of faculty are going to change. I think the full-time, non-adjunct, but non-tenure stream faculty will become maybe the single most important category. But in any event, the composition of those who educate will be very different, I think, under the pressure of possibility and constraint. And I'd invite both of you to speak to either of those issues.
So I'll take a crack. I mean, your own president, President Van Zandt, was a pioneer in thinking about temporality in law schools and to move away from the conventional 3 years in law school and to try to have 2-year degree. And I think that was a very good idea, 2 years where people would work over the summer intensive courses. To me, there's nothing sacrosanct about this 4-year model that we've had. And moreover, we don't comply with that 4-year model. If you look at most places, most students don't graduate at state universities or state colleges in 4 years. They're in and out of the labor force. They have to work part-time. They can't get the courses they want, whatever it is. So even at flagship universities, the graduation rates are relatively never much above 60% or 55%. And that's often within 5 or 6 years. So I think that will be under a lot of debate, I hope. Somebody mentioned Peter Thiel. I debated Peter Thiel in Chicago a couple of weeks ago, and he's the gentleman that's given this money, as mentioned, for dropouts. And when you really pushed Peter, what he didn't like was not universities so much. He went to Stanford himself, and I asked him where his kids all went. They all went to very good places. And what he didn't like was 4-year liberal arts places of a certain kind. He wasn't against STEM work. And even there, I think he was very wrong. But it's interesting that a lot of his complaint was the temporality, the structure, which that part I wasn't unsympathetic to. So I think at the professional schools, we're seeing change, though not everybody has raced for David's innovations. But I think time will come. These things take time at universities. It's true in the business schools already, or joint business law programs, which David also pioneered in thinking about how Kellogg and law school could do things together in a shorter period of time. And the other point that I wanted to make about one I didn't make, I skipped over on the salary and cost side, the faculty thing. So as you all know, at a lot of the state universities, then this push to adjunct faculties. And it has bad aspects. A lot of it is bad. And it's just cost saving. But there are some good aspects, particularly in some of the professional schools, where we've always wanted to leaven the teaching with practitioners. And I like that for a significant amount of undergraduate teaching as well, where you bring in people from, quote, the real world, whether you bring in engineers or you bring in scientists, working scientists, and have them work with students. So I think there's a lot to be done on the faculty mix and also on the question of getting away from this somewhat rigid structure we have, which in the real time we don't honor anyway.
We need to come to the New School for Public Engagement, where we pride ourselves on being a community of scholars and practitioners together.
If I may, I agree. There is really no sanctity to the current temporal arrangement. And when you look at these calendars, there's enough written about it. There are links to old agrarian societies and lunar calendars and so on. I am reminded, Seymour Papert wrote quite a bit about QWERTY, the structure of the typewriter's keyboard, and how the particular arrangement of keys was really because in the old design of it, the keys used to jam. Right, but then it started a whole school of how typing was started, et cetera, which had nothing to do with how people learned, really. So it's almost analogous to that kind of situation. I think the question is really, and we're doing some experiments around modularity, et cetera, at MIT, and trying to see how can we give some. We care about a lot of non-formal education experiences. We want students to have many more global experiences, but the curriculum just doesn't give any breathing time. It is jam-packed, there's a lot, and it's accompanied by statements like drinking from the fire hose in intensity, as if there's a lot of value to it. But so you really have to think about how do you mitigate the pain of breaking down the current temporal arrangements, because we also find students who want to do these kinds of things over lifelong, they feel disconnected from a lot of experiences that the situated learning environment provides. So I think there are opportunities there, and we really have to think about it. A comment, I think these 2 points are fantastic. The composition part, we know even now it takes a village within the learning experience, and it really, I was struck by your comment about federal mandates and student services, which add to the administrative staff, because all that is the educational support and scaffolding that we provide. And what in an institution, and that's all part of the educational ecosystem, service ecosystem. And one of the things that you are able to do, and increasingly so, as things like open study, peer-to-peer university, all the stuff that's going on online, find is you're extending the community. And there are intentional communities that are being formed, which allow you much more of what you can't get within, or ways to creatively extend this notion of a village.
I think I'm mindful that people are starting to ask questions, but I'll just make a quick comment that it seems to me that last sense of extending the village and the whole concept of the metaversity raises large questions about what are the boundaries of the institution under this new system. And I'll just leave that for more conversation. But over to you, and folks should feel free to line up in front of the other mic.
Yes, so my name is William Grassi. I'm with the Meta-Nexus Institute. And I don't use the QWERTY keyboard. I use the Dvorak simplified keyboard for many years now. I want to suggest that the good news may not be so good. One of the reasons that it was painless for MIT with some expense to give away so many courses is actually because there's very little value. It really doesn't threaten their business model. And that what happens in a face-to-face classroom or in a conference like this is completely different than what happens otherwise. When I taught at Temple University in the 90s, I was involved in some of their early experiments with online learning. Was completely disappointed because you take students out of the classroom and the whole motivation for doing the work, doing the reading, the potential of being embarrassed in front of their peers by the professor. So the real problem in education is motivation to do the work, and it's something that has to be learned and acquired. And if we were all self-disciplined, the libraries have always existed, and we could all be autodidacts and independent scholars, but it's the community itself, the embodied community, as this embodied conference is, that makes the difference. And so, in fact, it's easy, or easier, increasingly, to give away this content, but we really can't replace the face-to-face meetings, and that's just the expensive part of what we do. So your comments are welcome.
Vijay, do you want to speak to that?
Certainly, and I think that's, first of all, I applaud that is true. It was not in terms of the cost of production and stuff, but the educational cost of doing OpenCourseWare was indeed low, which is why, I made a reference to the fact that we fessed up and said we don't know how to do what we care about in the online world. So we'll take a picture of what we know how to do well and put it out there. But it does raise the challenge now. But now there's this, the fact that there are all kinds of opportunities and affordances that are created now that you have to think about now that we have this asset and there's this growing phenomenon. And it is indeed a very hard problem to think about. How do you recontextualize and re-express or express some of the things that you care about as being attributes of quality education in this new world of online and open? And that is a challenge, and there are some significant experiences. The only, almost like a caveat that I'll point out over here, I think it's important that we think about what we are measuring over here, because it's nice, one of the things we have to acknowledges the way we might be thinking about what education is about and outcomes might be entirely different with this new set of production functions, these new kinds of engagements. And which is not to say that the old was bad, but that the new might be different. And I think that is something that will bear some amount of rethinking as we start looking at new affordances of technology and so on.
So on the for-profits who have used a lot of online teaching, which is, in some ways it can be cheap, in some ways not so cheap, but mostly they did asynchronous online. And we found, at least in the one that I'm involved in, that in many ways we had better learning outcomes with synchronous. And so we've now started insisting that some of the classes be synchronous for the reasons the gentleman gave, of having students together at the same time, having them with faculty. So I mean, as Vijay said, the earliest thing was you plop a video down and somebody gives a lecture that they gave it, and they could have given it in a classroom or MIT, or they could put it out there. To me, that's the least interesting way of thinking about online teaching, which needs to be interactive in order to get good results. So I think we'll see lots of experimentation. And I do take the point, but I think there are ways of ameliorating this issue.
I think I'm going to take 2 or 3 responses, and then we'll sort of bundle our answers because I'm mindful of our time pressures.
Eve Proper, I have a question about technology. We've heard over the last night and today, and for the last 20 years, promises technology is going to change how we educate, which is finally starting to happen, but also there'll be big cost savings with these new delivery methods. And I really don't think we've been seeing those yet. So do you think that technology will actually result in cost savings at some point for universities, or is it just a new way of doing things?
Let me take one more, and then I'll have people respond.
Yeah, Jerry Spivak. It seems to me the problem that you raised about university costs and so on is the same problem that even secondary and primary education currently is dying from. And when we watch a Brian Greene, all of a sudden you can understand relativity, even though Einstein was supposed to be a little difficult at one time. So watching master teachers within a context of a classroom, it seems to me a brilliant way to approach it. The difficulty of both the university and the secondary situation is how does one then provide something? And it seems as if the only way to do it is to set up projects that students have to solve together under some kind of people that have some understanding of how to monitor that and so on. I'm wondering what things are happening at this time in those domains, because obviously this is the creative domain for the future, and I'm just wondering what kinds of things are actually happening in the world today.
So 2 questions about kind of the intersections of cost and pedagogy.
So, I don't think technology is necessarily a cost saver, but I think it can be. For the online teaching that the for-profits do, there are very high initial capital costs in developing the platforms. And then once they're developed, there's money saved by having lots of adjunct people. You employ low-cost faculty members, which, again, is not always a good thing, but it can be cost-saving. One of the things when we think about costs at universities, we don't often budget in all the costs. So you have a huge investment in capital structure. It was the campus question that I think Jonathan raised, Peter, I forget who it was. And even, I forgot to mention this, we don't even use the capital structure we have very efficiently. Faculty and students don't like to be there at 8 o'clock. When I was a student, you marched up the hill at Cornell and you went to 8 o'clock classes. Try to get students to come in for an 8 o'clock class today, unless, it's Orgo, which they have to go to if they want to do that. So you have an awful lot of inefficient use of your capital plan. But if you're adding lots of students into the mix, whether you add them at any particular university, and you don't want to build new classroom facilities, having online interactive teaching for at least a course that may have quite the right answer, say in statistics or math, as compared to art history, maybe you can really save on the capital costs, and it's maybe an relatively inexpensive way to reach a larger group of students. So I think, there's no magic to technology. It can be very useful, and you can save money in some ways. You certainly can collaborate more. I think you mentioned this. You can collaborate globally. We can have surgeons now who do surgery with people, that they direct, robotics, from a very long distance. I think it opens up huge possibilities for us, not always to save money, but to allow us I presided over 3 huge systems at Northwestern: a student enterprise system, a financial system, an information technology system. And I was told how much money we would save and how much personnel we'd be able to cut out. And at the end of the day, I never saw a dime worth of saving. But we were able to do things that we couldn't do heretofore, which expanded the possibilities for having better understanding of our research system, being able to comply with federal regulations, being able to have more collaboration. But if you're asking whether there was money saved at the end of the day, if so, I never noticed it.
So very quickly, yes, I want to say whatever he said, but cost. There are cost shifts. There are real opportunities for cost reductions, including sort of the paramedic kind of model when there's a community involved in the educational process. But I think there are a couple of issues, a couple of dimensions that get conflated, and which came up in last night's panel also. There is cost, and then there's affordability. So one of the things that, a slide that I did not show, for instance, there's this outfit called Flatwell Knowledge, and I'm looking at 800 colleges will utilize their open textbooks this year, saving 150,000 students, 12 million or more in textbook expenses. I'm advising a couple of projects for the Next Generation Learning Challenge, where we're seeing significant reductions because the cost of textbooks is a serious obstacle to access, right? So the cost of what it produced, someone bears the cost, and there are policy decisions about who's bearing the cost and what are the commons. But the fact that some of these have real potent opportunity and proven opportunity already based on some of the experiments that I'm looking at to increase the affordability of education. And I think that's an important dimension.
I just want to, before we get to our next comment, note that I think Jerry Spivak's comment about basically project-based active learning is a key problem for the future. If we develop what we might call economies of scale in teaching, whether they're digital economies or large lecture economies, the interaction between those new modes of pedagogy and kind of hands-on experiential active learning is a kind of key problem to solve.
My question really follows right on those remarks. I feel a kind of dissonance here with these predictions of a brave technological future and a certain amount of lip service to hands-on teaching, and not a great deal about the economics of that very important budget item, that is to say the faculty, the permanent faculty, if one's going to keep such a thing. I mean, the kind of teaching I do is enormously labor-intensive and expensive, and I think that's true certainly in the humanities and in a good deal of the social sciences. When Richard Levin became president of Yale, he proposed that we replace sections of large lecture courses, typically with 15 students, by online chat rooms. And as you would have predicted, he got a certain pushback from the faculty, and it never really happened, or it never happened on any significant scale. And so I guess what I'm worried about is, are my graduate students, the ones who are going out, going to have the luxury of hands-on teaching? And are we going to be able to preserve anything like a community of learning? I mean, Vijay, you referred to larger communities, and I like that vision, but nonetheless, what we have known in American higher education so far, and it's served us very well, is something that at its best has been a community of teaching and learning. And I haven't really heard that issue addressed here.
Well,
Sure.
go ahead, Vijay.
Well, we have to acknowledge it's a challenge, and it goes back to your question also. Let me just give another cut at it. We believe part of the challenge over here is how do you take the value of learning, which is a deeply personal, interactive experience, and how do you take the value of that, but at the same time try to not lose the efficacy of that, but try to introduce the efficiency that these technologies bring. And so we have an example of a technology-enabled active learning course in physics that we talk about a lot, where the introductory physics has to be taken by all MIT students, 600 students in the freshman class, and who take it. It's a large lecture, and we were saying, look, how can you talk about, almost like that, how can you talk about intimacy and a high bandwidth of interactive experience in a 600-student lecture, right? And this doesn't compute. So one of the things that we started doing was looking at how you might create close collaborative group learning, studio-based learning, in order that you preserve the efficiency of the large size, and at the same time you did not compromise the fact that learning had to be interactive and active and so on. And also to the point that one of the things that we struggle with a lot, and I don't want to rush to give answers, but acknowledge that it is an important challenge. And even as late as last week, as we were talking about online education and so on, we said, look, a large part of, even though we talk about the fact that an undergraduate student's life at MIT is difficult, a lot of learning comes from that messiness, that challenge, that confusion, out of, that comes from the interaction. And are there ways of making sure that more of that is possible because of these affordances? Because if you start, I'm a systems analyst. When you step back and look at the production function of education, mechanistic as it might sound, not everything needs to be as is, and now you have alternatives to replace some components which might not be value adding for the same values that we desire. And that's the opportunity now to rethink that value chain and say, look, let's not compromise on those end goals, but see if all these elements are as necessary as we have believed hitherto.
So I just want to take one crack at it. I think here senior administrators, presidents and provosts have a very great responsibility in deciding what's the most essential in the value proposition. My experience before I came to Northwestern was 28 years at Princeton. And one of the things I liked best about Princeton was the fact that every student had to do a senior thesis. A very expensive way to teach. And even sometimes somewhat indifferent students, and I assure you, as you have found out by now, that there are some at Princeton, though most of them are quite good, many often benefited from that experience of really pulling up their bootstraps. So one of the things when I came to Northwestern I was very committed to was expanding what in quotes could be called research opportunities for undergraduates. Here you have this great research faculty, and by research opportunities, I don't mean science and engineering exclusively. I mean working in some research way with people in the humanities and the social sciences and doing something creative, for that matter, in the performing arts. We had a lot of people that worked in the performing arts, and I was willing to spend a lot of money on making available funds so that could be done, because I thought it really was a core value, and there are other things under pressure I would rather get rid of and put the money there. But I do think that's the job of deans and provosts and presidents, making those decisions, even under budgetary pressures of what is it that we're about? What is it we most want to do and need to do? And I would be very reluctant to give up the kind of intimate teaching that can be done at a research university, though it's not always easy to do it. In some ways easier to do at a liberal arts college. But if we don't have undergraduates working with research faculty in that way, what was the point for undergraduates coming to a research university? Then they should have gone to Swarthmore and Haverford and Williams. If they're going to come to us and we can't do that for them, we haven't done a big part of our job.
I'd like, if I may, just to add two more comments. One is that I think we're just at the beginning of thinking pedagogically about new forms that kind of undo the kind of opposition between the small face-to-face classroom seminar and something that's instrumental and thinned out. There's at Michigan, where I taught for a long time, there was a famous and very successful experiment in distributed peer-led teaching of chemistry. It's become a national model with better learning outcomes, advanced undergraduates leading other undergraduates. We have a lot of work to do to find new ways of teaching and learning. I think the second thing I'd say is to voice something that's concerned me all through the conference, which is that we've basically taken, I think, research universities and then as their other elite liberal arts colleges as the landscape of undergraduate education. 80% of BA attainers in the United States go to non-research public branches, to Central Michigan University and SUNY Brockport and Brooklyn College. And for all the issues that we think about and all the ways that we imagine both problems and solutions, that is the landscape that's the future of higher education. If we don't have good answers to, and that's where I would argue the vast majority of Peter's graduate students and the graduate students I used to teach at Michigan will be. I feel like we've often been a little narrow in imagining the landscape of the problem in thinking only about the pressures on research universities and liberal arts colleges. Why don't we take these last two comments and then we'll do our own last remarks.
Hi, I'm Kathleen, New School for Public Engagement. It has to do sort of with, so we saw some patterns in terms of the market, in terms of the job market. You tend to be less likely to be unemployed and you tend to have a higher income depending upon your degree, the type of degree, the level, where you went to college, et cetera, et cetera. I've used open education to gain skills online and to implement and join the labor force in creative sort of fields. And I'm wondering if you have any specific insights into what that relationship will be once you sort of open it to everyone, and what value the certifications that we're paying for would have anymore if everyone had access to lectures from sort of what is considered a higher quality, higher education institution. And it goes into the comment you had about public education versus private or higher education.
Thanks. Why don't we take one more and then I'll invite Henry and Vijay to respond to both.
Hi, my name is Kevin Kiley. I'm a reporter with Inside Higher Ed. The College Board's most recent report on the cost of higher education, one of its main findings is that net tuition over the last 10 years, what students are actually paying tuition-wise, hasn't gone up significantly. It's the costs associated with getting a university degree, rent, food, what you give up salary-wise. But what we talk about here is mostly the cost of educating students and how we can bring that down. What are some of the ideas out there on how to control these associated costs?
I'm looking at you, Henry.
Well, I'll take that up, and I think it relates in a way to the first question, too. I mean, the universities can't do much about rent and food in the macro economy. So I do think that the cost, and this is very true for adult learners or people in the labor force who go to community colleges or they go to for-profits, they're sometimes giving up time that they could be in the labor force. But it does, all the data, Peter Thiel to the contrary notwithstanding, and this comes to the young lady's question, shows, you could look at any labor economist who works on this stuff, the current chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, Alan Kruger, C.C. Rouse at Princeton. It shows year after year over a very long period of time that the returns to education, the premium to education, still works. It may not work right now in this labor market at quite the same rate it worked before, but it's still vastly positive. And so if you look at high school dropouts, you look at high school graduates, then you look at college, then you look at professional degrees, the premium, and by the way, there's a social premium, not just a private premium to wages, but there's a social premium, less crime, better health, premium to the whole society. You can see it city by city. Cities that have more college graduates do better than cities that have less. And there's lots of data on this cross country, looking at cities and regions. So I'm not concerned about the premium, and I think in the sense it's still there and it's very buoyant. And I'm not concerned about more access. I mean, it was an interesting question because there were models that said as more people got secondary degrees, BAs, BSs, it would drive the labor costs down because more people would have it. It didn't turn out this way. More supply was good, rather than bad. And by the way, for cities that have more college graduates, non-college graduates have a higher wage, as well as the graduates themselves. There's a spillover effect that works. So what's happened in the United States, the problem in the United States, is not that we've had more supply, and whether you get it from open source or whether you get it from the for-profits or whatever. The problem is that post-secondary education in the United States, as a percentage of the total population, is declining internationally. So we once were the highest, or very high at least, in post-secondary enrollment, and today we're down. It's not, I mean, when you look at the countries that are ahead of us, it's often surprising as to who's ahead of us in this. I don't see how you compete in an ever more technological world, in a world that requires more skilled and where lots of industrial labor jobs go away or require more technology. Mm-hmm. How do you compete if you don't have a skilled labor force? And we're even seeing this now when people say, oh, there are jobs that are there, but there's not a labor force which matches them. It's to some extent true. So I'm not worried about more supply or how people get that education. I don't care where they get it from. I don't care whether they get it from state colleges, where they get it from community colleges, or they get it from elite universities. The premiums may be somewhat different. There may be social status interactions which add to the premium if you come from MIT and who you know there, or you come from Stanford or Columbia or whatever. Everybody benefits. The data is just overwhelming. I could give you a list of references. And so people who think that there isn't a premium, a lifetime stream of earnings premium to higher education, no matter how you get it. It does, and we're talking about on average. It doesn't mean that every university or every for-profit does a good job. They don't, of course. But it's a very clear and demonstrable labor economy effect. So I think more education is a good thing. It's the glories of American education, maybe we've been talking about a restricted number of things, has been this heterogeneity of it, and it's under pressure everywhere you look. And the country will not be served well if we have a problem of access. The country will be served very poorly if people on the lower income stream can't get somewhere in this system. And the more opportunity they can get in terms of their own merit and their own skill, and it does come back to K through 12. The fact is, in New York and LA and Chicago, if my percentages are right, and they are right, that 8% of your students that graduate in the Chicago public school system are college ready. It means, and this came up last night, that an awful lot of what's being done is remedial education. I'd rather do it than not do it. We better do it, no matter where we do it and how we do it, or we'll really be in the soup. But it's not great that we're having to do it. And by the way, while I gave that figure, in Chicago, 57% of the people who enter the Chicago public school system in high school, 57% graduate at the other end. So the 8% that I've given you of being college ready are 8% of that 57% who actually graduated. Those are disastrous numbers for the country. And if policymakers don't understand that, they really have their head in a very bad place.
Vijay.
Well, I think there's a lot that's been said about why one would want to come to college as different from online experiences. And I think it bears one of the things that's happening, and that certainly there's an opportunity to do now, is really think carefully about what is the value that's being added, or what is the value that's being provided in situated learning experiences, and we would be remiss to pass up on the opportunity. And for things that we might care about, whether it's making research and learning much more proximal, the interaction and so on. And one of the things I was remembering Jamshed's comment yesterday about remembering things and forgetting things. And one of the big opportunities that it happens, and there's a wonderful satirical video by Father Gabe on the internet. If you look it up, it's called the 5-Minute College. You should look it up. Just Google 5-Minute College. It's hilarious, And his pitch is really that everything I learned, you could learn in 5 minutes, and you can give a degree for it, And he goes on to suggest why. But the real story over here is that you're going to need constant updates and constant knowledge updates. And one of the things, if we have this compact with our learners as registered to our educational society, the institution or a collective of institutions, we can actually live up to that compact of being available to those learners over a lifetime to provide knowledge updates, to provide education as things change. It is quite telling. When we had launched OpenCourseWare in the beginning, after a couple of years, there was a time when we were looking at the hits on the website, and there were these sudden spikes. And we were trying to figure out why. And it's interesting. Then when we did some probing and analysis, we found out that it was coincident with the dot-com bust in the Silicon Valley. So there were lots of people who were out of jobs and say, oh, this is a chance to go catch up and learn some new stuff and so on. So we might want to think about, what are the other opportunities that because when we give a degree or a certification, it's a proxy also for an accountability statement which says, look, I'm reasonably assuring that over the lifetime of a profession, you'll know what you need to know. It's not an assurance that we can give lightly now, and I think these things will allow us to live up to that compact in a much better way. And and as far as cost goes, it's a tricky question. I mean, we have talked about simple things like reducing redundancies and so on. But I'm going to get out of this technology thing for a second. One of the very interesting notions, and this morning when we were listening to President John Colin about talking about learning space, about spaces, there's a lot of thinking in the learning spaces architects community about landscapes, about learning landscapes. And what they're really talking about is saying, look, there's a lot of stuff we have to provide for in an institution, but let's say we are situated in an urban environment. This is not a new notion, but we don't have to have all those spaces over here. We can think about how can we leverage spaces that are available in the city for small auditoriums, for different kinds of things. And if you start thinking, I used to joke, I had a parking problem at MIT, but once I decided to park illegally, the whole campus opened up. So you might want to think more expansively and see those are how you might affect cost in a different way by sort of looking at a much wider range of providing opportunity.
I think illegal parking and squatting is a great place to end what's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
That's a model.
It has a cost.